just kind of exploded because, when I first started talking about the corruption in the American banking system, it was right about the time that Trump took office, and then he started saying deep state and fake news, and those kind of went through the mainstream. And so now, now it seems that at least a third, in my opinion, a third of Americans are looking at an alternative narrative to the kind of the mainstream that's often given to us. But Charles, you joined my show before, and I've joined your show, and you've been very eloquent in reaching out to me. For listeners who this is their first time being acquainted with your work, give a quick introduction to what you've done historically, where you came from, and then we'll get into your newest project.
Sure. Thank you very much, Ian. I've been involved in a national business years ago. I started doing talk radio probably about 20 years ago now, mainly because I was spending a lot of time in the car, and I fell in love with talk radio. And I was amazed by the insight and intelligence of the caller, but especially whom I found to be a lot more intelligent than some of those who give us received wisdom in the media, the pundits. And so I began to do talk radio in different formats around my own hometown of Boston and several markets. And I was then inspired to write articles, which turned into books. I've now been the author of over 20 nonfiction books, and I do a YouTube channel that streams live every day. Since the pandemic, I've been devoted to writing these short books, these almost novellas, and I'm doing an average of one every 2 months. And the one that we're talking about today, the Satanic Conspiracy, and if you don't mind, I'd like to just hold it up here. This one is the 5th installment. Right now I'm working on a book called The Blue Anon Conspiracy. But this one I wrote, it's a little different than the usual type of things I write about, which is politics and economy and culture. This dealt with spirituality. It dealt with God. And it was a bookend to my first pamphlet, which was God is God. This one takes a look at the other side of the coin, which is Satan and the satanic influence and how it affects our lives and our society, and what we could do to identify it and call it out as a way of keeping it at bay. We're never going to get rid of it because only God can do that. And satanic temptation and satanic influence is everywhere. It's in us and around us. But by knowing truths and by identifying it, we can do a great deal to put it in its place and regulate it. I argue that the American system is the best system that man's ever devised to do that, as imperfect as it is. And I basically point out both the nature of God and the nature of Satan in this brief book.
Wow. Okay. So that's taking on a lot. I've had on my show in the past a fellow that has written extensively. I think he's got a degree from Oxford, if I remember that right. I'm not sure. His name is Tobias Churton. Mm-hmm. And he was pretty marvelous, pretty fascinating. The kind of the discussion that he brought, but you're making a really good point, Charles, and I personally, when I started doing what I do, I tried not to get political, and now I just seem like I'm constantly just having to defend our basic rights, freedom of speech, for, like you're saying, this is the most perfect document, the Constitution of governance that man has ever written. The human species being, don't take offense to those that are female. It's just the way it is. But I'll open up a can of worms there. But I try not to get political and I try not to get religious. But it's very difficult as time goes on, because we're seeing so many of these attacks, not only on our way of life, but as you're saying, on, for instance, SB 145, I think it's called, out of San Francisco, which gives the homosexual man, adult man, rights to have a sexual relationship with an underage boy that is no younger than 14. So within that age of 14 and 18, which is considered a minor, it is now illegal in the state of California to have a homosexual relationship with that minor as an adult. How is that not pedophilia? I don't understand.
Ian, is that actually something that has become law in California?
Gavin Newsom signed it last April, I believe. This is a standing
Because
law.
that's incredible. I mean, any moral society protects the innocence of their children. Children are not consensual. They're not developed enough emotionally, physically, spiritually to consent to any kind of sexual activity. That's why we have statutory rape laws. I mean, that's an outrage that this would happen.
Charles, I'm going to throw something else your way. In that I recently, on that same note, now the World Health Organization is calling for, I believe it's school districts. Somebody just sent this to me from Canada, that they are now allowing. They're saying that there is an informed consent for minors, so that a minor can be forced to receive some type of a clause. I'm not saying this correctly, but some type of clause where a minor can receive a vaccination without the parental.
Oh my God.
The parental. I guess. And Charles, I get into your. The other thing is this: is that Disney, widely respected, of course. Walt Disney seemed to be a marvelous man. Disney is now. And again, I try to be. Surprisingly, I do try to be liberal.
I understand. You have to be careful what you say in this environment.
But I'm going to throw this out there, Charles. It's the Disney is now hiring young men to play the role, as a costumed character in their theme parks, to play the young role of a princess, i.e., Cinderella.
Well, that's part of the. That's part of, I mean, look, I think that the transgender thing is a manifestation of the transhumanist movement, which is something that's been around for a long time. Yes. And basically what it is it's trying to do and accomplish the ultimate dream of the socialistic worldview, which is for man to author existence, that we can be whatever we want to be, and that there'll be an enlightened clique of people who are going to decide, because if anything is whatever you say it is, then nothing is nothing. And therefore you have to have a group of people, a clique that claims to be smarter than the rest of us, who are then going to tell us the way to be. And the idea of blurring realities, such as the existence of a male and a female, which is something that's science and it's irrefutable, and it's obvious, it is part of that agenda. In other words, you can wake up and be whatever it is you want. If you're old, you can be young, which would be nice, wouldn't it? Hey, I can grow up. I've decided I'm going to be rich. I mean, it's right. I mean, it's in a sense, you can invent yourself and be whatever it is you want to be, and it is no mooring on reality. I mean, the reality is you can only be male or female. That's just the way it is. That's science.
It's nature. Yeah, sure. Right.
And they'll say, oh, well, some people have some feminine aspects or masculine aspects. That's fine, but there's still a man and a woman, because if you could be, I'm sorry we're getting so politically incorrect here, but since you brought it up, Ian, I mean, if you can be both a man and a woman, that would mean that you have testicles and ovaries, and you can impregnate yourself. That's not possible scientifically. You either have one or the other. You are either male or female. So, this whole business is a form of insanity, and the fact that it would be foisted on children it's more than morally wrong. I mean, we have right now an assistant secretary of Health and Human Services, this Levine character, who during confirmation hearings said that it was okay for children to receive drugs and surgeries to change their sex. Now that is the epitome of a Nazi-like human experimentation. It's evil. Now, if you have a child who says, gee, I really think I'm actually a boy or a girl, and I see that as a psychological problem, but nevertheless, even if that were the case, they still have to wait until they're of a consensual age. You don't do this when you're a child. It's just not the time for it. Children are not developed yet sexually, let alone mentally or emotionally, to make those kinds of decisions, whatever they think they are. This is a basic issue. This is why we have families. This is why we have fathers and mothers. A child doesn't, have that kind of sovereignty, not until they reach the age of consent, the age of legality. And in which case, if they want to think they're a boy or a girl, that's their business. That's fine. But, we have an obligation to protect the innocence and, frankly, the rights of our children. That's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, that's incredibly well said, and to the point. Bruce Jenner, it's whether you like it or not, it is respectable because he's made that decision as an adult.
Right.
There's a large difference as to what you're arguing here, and that the minor should not be making that decision.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. I mean, if he wants to do that as an adult and legally go through the process, fine. That's his business. And I'll go along with that. I mean, that's okay. But especially if they do the surgery, I mean, then you can say, okay, fine. They want to change their sex. You're making an adult decision. I may not think it's a healthy thing to do, but look, I'm fat. Is that healthy? We all have our foibles. In a way, getting back to my thesis of the Satanic Conspiracy,
yeah.
We all have, satanic tendencies, or what they call in Judaism, the Yetzer Hara, the satanic inclination. It's everywhere. It's around us from the minute we're born. It is inside of us. And you develop a character that can see it and perceive it, and then make decisions based upon those influences. And, that's just part of existence. But where you have a literal manifestation of Satan enter the picture is when you are going to not only pretend that something that is not right or is evil or is false is true and is good, but you're going to promote that as good. It's one thing. I mean, if you're going to tell me that you're going to promote something that is obviously contrary to human nature, contrary to reality, and tell me it's real, that is the satanic element in practice. It's one thing to be fallible and to make mistakes and to fall into sin, but you have to know that it is sin. You have to understand that you're doing that and be conscious of it. It's our ability as rational, conscious human beings created in the image of God, and God separated us from all other beings by giving us that ability to reason, that ability, that what we call conscience and consciousness, actually. You have to be able to employ that in the quest for truths. So if you're going to tell me there's something that is obviously false is true, then that is the manifestation of Satanism.
That's a great kind of explanation and definition. Are you Jewish?
Yes.
So Charles, let's get into your book a little bit, and certainly the Satanic Conspiracy, the specter hunting mankind. You've got a looks like a building that reminds me of the pyramid in Cairo, the Egyptian pyramid. Explain for let's get into your book. Explain for listeners the consistency of your book. What entails your book? Let's get into your book here, Charles.
Sure. Thank you, Ian. Excuse me. I start out with a simple, kind of a takeoff on my earlier book, which is a simple mathematical equation that proves the existence of God as a creator of the universe. I could get into that if you'd like. It's very brief, but
sure. Yeah.
All right. Basically that, it's a basic mathematical axiom, and it's a basic observable element of science and nature, that you cannot create something out of nothing. You have to have something to have something. Zero, the concept of zero is one of the most ancient concepts, and zero is the symbol of nothing. Anything bigger than zero is something. Anything less than zero in the negative is also something, because it's a manifestation of the removal of something, which is a reflection. So, you cannot create a universe out of nothing. It's not scientific. You have to have had either, you can accept the Eastern religious view, which is manifest in the New Age movement, and that is that everything is perpetual. There was no beginning. Everything goes on forever. There's no end. There's no beginning. I think that it's easy to disprove that. I mean, a basic idea such as erosion disproves it. Because if the world has been here forever, it would be like as shiny as a marble because of the elements. It would have been, there would be no life. But putting that aside, the Western conception is that something came out of nothing. There was an event. What scientists call it the Big Bang. That's fine. What caused the bang? There was something that happened outside of nature to create nature. And that something is God. There was a supernatural as opposed to natural event. And that event was a trigger point by which nothing became something. There is no other explanation for that, because in science and in math, you cannot create something out of nothing. Only God can do that. So thus, God created the universe out of nothing. That was the only way that could happen. And once it happened, and God created men and women, and the Old Testament, what Christians call the Old Testament, what in Judaism we call the Torah, it says in the book of Genesis that God created men and women in his image. And it does say women also, which gets to the basic conception of the equality of the sexes. And that as such, we were separated from all other beings by being created in the image of God. And what is it that makes us separate? The thing that makes us separate from all beings is our ability to reason, our ability to think, and our ability to develop and conceive and integrate knowledge as we think about it. I mean, the first act in the book of Genesis that Adam does once he becomes conscious is that God commands him to name all living things, to give everything a name. The giraffe, the bear, the elephant. Thus, he gave him language. He gave him the ability to communicate with words and with sentences. That is what separates us from all other beings. We can communicate with each other. We can use language as a means to store value, which established abstract truths as opposed to physical truths. And we can then develop civilizations based upon the science that we gather as a result of our language, and we build upon to improve our civilization. And we can also perceive good and evil. We can perceive that which is true, and we can at the same time fend off that which is false. But inherent in that gift, if you will, of language and of reason and of consciousness is the also inherent fact that we are not God. We don't know everything. We cannot know all good and all evil. We cannot be supreme. Only God is that. And thus, as imperfect beings and as frail beings, frankly, we are susceptible to falsehood. We are susceptible to indulging ourselves in all the temptations that are around us in a way that is destructive and that hurts us and that pulls us away from truths and pulls us away from God. And that's the tension of human life. That is the tension of our civilizations. And our ability to advance as civilizations and as human beings is our ability to make that discernment and make those choices, and to do so in a way that brings us closer to truths, closer to reality, closer to goodness, and closest to God.
So let me ask you this question here. We know through the Bible, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not an excellent student of that book, but my understanding is, and I'm going to run this by you and get your thought on this. My understanding, Charles, is that Satan, as we are known to refer to the adversary, right? To I suppose God, yet Satan is a creation of God. So the adversary to truth or good, right? So that allies to would be perceived to be evil which is subject unto itself. But there are some of these innate things that a human being is born with that we know. For instance, if we cause harm to another person, that isn't good, right? So some of these things, religious or not, some of these things we know just as being a human being, they're good and bad. So Satan, according to my understanding, was not granted a soul. I might be wrong on that. If Satan is not given a soul, for instance, you sell, some of these songs, historically rock and roll, they sell their soul to Satan and that sort of thing, because he's unable to possess his own, or she, or whatever it is. If Satan is unable to have a soul, let's look at this transhumanism concept, or what we see rolling out today. Is the concept of Satan, is this energy or this form or whatever it is it a machine? A machine
is just an inanimate object. A machine is something that man creates and that reflects only what man puts into it, even if it's millions of pieces of information. A machine cannot think, and a machine cannot experience and feel. A machine is not alive, and a machine cannot reason. It can be programmed to reason, and it can do an incredible job of that. I mean, better than the human mind in a way, but it doesn't cross the line in terms of being alive. And the transhumanism movement, I think one of their agendas is to evolve a new kind of species of man. Darwin is one of the patron saints of this movement. This idea that man is evolving into a superior species, and that is going to somehow marginalize or kill off the less evolved species. I mean, that was in the political manifestation of that. The ultimate one is Nazism, but also communism, in that they want to evolve societies in a way that brings us to eventually a utopian perfection on Earth, which is a complete overthrow of God. And in the communist movement, that is when the entire planet becomes one massive ant colony. That we have absolute equality. We've surrendered any element of our unique individual identity that would make us unequal, because the ultimate virtue is equality. We are equal in that we're born equal and we die equal, and that our souls are equal. But in this physical world, we're not equal, because we have different skills, different circumstances, different levels of luck. There's a lot of very complex factors. And that part of freedom and part of free will is the fact that we have the ability to pull ourselves up or pull ourselves down based upon our own choices. So we're not going to be equal de facto. We'll be equal du jour in that we're all living and that we'll all be dead. But, this idea of absolute equality is a false paradigm.
Yeah, and even Plato was writing about the concept of utopia. So this is a couple thousand years old in our known literature. What is the conspiracy? The Satanic Conspiracy. Why is it that you've named your book and such?
I do argue that we're talking about a conspiracy. It's a conspiracy that goes back to the moment that Adam and Eve conspired together to overthrow God by partaking of the forbidden fruit. And thus, by trying to, in other words, by doing that, they would become gods. They would know all things. They would know good and evil. They would essentially overthrow God in heaven and replace God with an earthly existence where they would be in control of all of the universe. And that God punished them for that by banishing them from the Garden of Eden and surrounding them with sin. So that conspiracy has continued in every generation ever since. And I think that in modern times, it has manifested itself in different ways, mainly through the development of secret societies. Now, Satan and conspiracy can only exist in secret. You can't have it out in the open because it's illegal, right, because it's immoral, because it's trying to subvert the will of free people. through deception or through crime or through fraud. I mean, the most obvious example of a criminal secret society would be the mafia, right? Organized crime. They're not going to, they get together in secret and they plan criminal activities. If they did it in the open, they'd be arrested. They wouldn't get away with it. So what I would contend is that some secret societies, not all, because there are probably good ones as well. The problem is we don't know because they are secret, so we can't know. But it's clearly that you can clearly note that there's a pattern of action and behavior that emanates from certain secret societies, which indicate that they are trying to overthrow God in heaven, that they are trying to rule the world, that they do have this utopian idea that they need to, an elite, a small group of elites are smarter than the rest of us, and that they should control us for our own good. There are movements that are based on such conspiratorial views. Communism is an obvious example. Nazism is as well. They believe that they're transforming the world through force, and they believe they're morally justified in doing that. And I argue in the book that I point out that there was a group of secret societies that originally subverted and damaged Judaism in the 17th century, and that there was a group of conspiracies and secret societies that damaged Christianity in the 18th century. And I document that right up till today. The problem, as I point out, is that it's becoming more acute in our own time than it ever has been, even more so than during the height of Stalin and Hitler. And the reason it's more dangerous now, even though we don't know it yet, is because of the development of modern science and technology, because of things like artificial intelligence and transhumanism and space travel and computer technologies and cloud technologies. These are vehicles that are great vehicles in the hands of the right person, but when they're in the hands of the conspirators, they can be used to control the world. They're not going to do it in the open. They're not going to declare, it's not going to be like George Orwell, where they have some guy come on the TV screen and and if you hide from him, you could end up banished. They're going to do it through subterfuge. They're going to do it without your knowing it. And we as citizens and as sovereign people living, created in the image of God, deriving sovereignty from God, not the state, which is the American philosophy, it is incumbent on us to identify this when we see it, and to learn to see it, and to learn to identify it. And I'm an optimist. I think we are. I think that, in our own time, frankly, the Trump movement is an example of people becoming conscious. There are movements in Europe that are doing this. The Brexit movement, European nationalism in the better sense of the word. There's movements even in China that are moving in this direction. So I think people are becoming conscious and aware of the fact that this web of elitist, secretive, powerful entities which interact with each other on an international basis and which have taken the high ground in our culture, our economy, our politics, and even in our religions, that we're seeing what they are, we're identifying who they are and what they are, and we are challenging it. I just hope we can do it in time.
Well, that's a can of worms there that you've opened. We can go a lot of angles from there, but let's scale it back and say what you've basically revealed or argued in your book, which looks fascinating. And by the way, for listeners to understand, you may know this, Charles, there are pyramids in the Asian continent, the country of China, that government deliberately, and this is out of research done by, I believe, a German. I'm not sure if it was German or Swedish, somewhere in Northern Europe, that the government is deliberately covering up so that the satellite cannot see them. So this pyramid that appears on your book seems to be, they have these structures around the world. But the point here, my question is this Adam and Eve, therefore, would these two individuals be satanic? Would they be satanic?
No. There's no, look, I mean, this is maybe an area where Judaism and Christianity have a slightly different perception of the satanic influence. even though we both derive it from the same source, which is the Torah, and even though our views have cross-pollinated over time and ever since, and are more similar than different, and both are legitimate in my opinion, but the Christian idea is a bit more anthropomorphic. I mean, there's actually they put a lot of emphasis on symbols, which I would argue are satanic, and we should know about them. We could talk. It's a fascinating subject. I don't know if you've ever interviewed Jay Dyer. He's very
yes, of
yeah.
course.
I've had him on my show many times. He's very, very good on this, and there are other people who are experts on it. It's not my area of expertise, but it's important to know this and to identify it, because these symbols do mean things, and they are embraced. In fact, I'm having on a new author who just wrote a book about Aleister Crowley, who talks about this. But the Jewish emphasis is more on the Yetzer Hara, which is a concept by which the satanic element is more of an influence that exists in the absence of good, in the absence of awareness and consciousness, and in the absence of truth. And so that the best way to combat that influence is to stand up and speak truths and mean it and expose evil and expose falsehood. So it's a little bit more philosophical. And I think perhaps the ultimate nexus of both views might be what I would argue is probably the greatest man who's ever lived, and that would have been Jesus of Nazareth, who stood up to the Roman Empire in the person of Pontius Pilate, who said to him, I represent God on earth. I'm the ruler of the world. And he turned to him and he said, I answer to a higher authority. And of course, within an hour of saying that, he was crucified. When he did that, he stood up for every individual ever since, that we do not answer to a created reality by men and women. We do not answer to the state. We answer to a higher authority. We answer to the great sovereign God. And in our limited and imperfect sovereignty, because we're not God, we're images of God, we nevertheless do derive our rights, as Thomas Jefferson so eloquently put, from the Creator, and who gives us inalienable rights. I mean, the American theory, the American philosophy and system of government is based upon that Christian idea that was the great gift of Jesus, that we derive, and from the Old Testament too, of course, the book of Genesis, God created men and women in his image. We derive our rights from the Creator and not from the state. And when we become aware of that, when we contemplate that, when we pray on that, we do become more aware of what is true. And we also become subsequently aware of what's not true.
And that's likely the most tyrannical act ever conceived of any type of government, is combining church and state. And we need look no further than our neighbor to the south as to where they developed the foundation of the present country that they have. What's happening now? You made a very strong comment here, in that you have mentioned Nazism, and I believe the first time you joined Discussion of Truth, we had spoken about your research with Adolf Hitler and being funded by a Muslim, wasn't it?
The Mufti, yeah. Mm-hmm.
What was it?
The Mufti Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He worked with Hitler, and he exported much of the Nazi socialist ideology into the Middle East and into the war against the state of Israel, and then the development of modern radical Islam, which was a departure, I think, from conventional Islam.
But take Nazism, and then you've also mentioned Stalin, and so you're saying, are you saying, Charles, that the reality, if you will, that seems to be very apparent globally now, and with that said, yesterday an Irishman who's a great researcher into himself, his name is Fintan Dunn, joined the program, and he said literally, Charles, he says America is the salvation at this moment for the world. I mean, if Americans don't stand up for this tyranny, it's going to this global system is going to take control. And anyway, so but I want to get your comments, because you had equated, I believe you had equated to what we're living in 2021 to Stalin being worse than the era of Stalin. And so then, of course, I'm throwing in Nazism as well. Elaborate on that and explain that for listeners as to how you view this.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's worse than Stalin or any of that. I would say that we are setting the stage for that if we don't wake up. And I think that what we've just witnessed in this country, I don't want to go into this, but let's just say the last election and some of the improprieties. We don't want to go too far into that because I don't want to get you banned from YouTube. But just some of the things that we've seen, I think, in terms of the machinations of this international-oriented, interlocking conspiracy, and I do use that word, of secretive organizations and societies to try to control the narrative, to control the world, is something that they're about to march forward in a big way, and it very well could become analogous to Stalin, although I don't think it's going to be openly such, or they're on their last legs. I tend to be optimistic and think the latter. I think they're on their last legs, but I don't take it for granted, because you cannot take your sovereignty under God for granted. You can't take freedom for granted. You can't take liberty for granted. It doesn't grow on trees. You don't just wake up in the morning and roll up the window and look out to see it. Oh, gee, I'm free. It's America. Everything. No, you have to work for it. You have to contribute somehow. Ian, you contribute with your show. I try to contribute with mine and my books. Everyone can find something they can do, even if it's just talking to a couple of people in your circle. But we need to raise awareness about the nature of freedom and contrast it with elements and ideas that are trying to erode it, because they're false. The truth will win out, but it could be at a terrible cost unless we wake up enough people. The question is, how many people are woken up in the real sense? And I think that there's a lot of people who are. I actually feel pretty optimistic about it.
You mentioned they a couple times. Elaborate for listeners. Who are they? It's an identification that can be used so loosely. Who is they in your view, in your research?
They are the cabal of people who are at war with God and are at war as such with man. They have an image that is different than that which exists in nature, which is the sovereign individual under God, and which is the societies and the governments and the religions that help to foster that sovereignty and promote and advance that sovereignty. If they're involved with something that is unnatural and something that seeks to transfer that sovereignty to some sort of an external control, then they are satanic by nature. And it's that tendency that we're up against. It has become more entrenched. It involves secret societies in the political realm, in the economic realm, even in the religious and spiritual realm, that seek control. Control is an unnatural thing. We don't want to be controlled. We answer to a higher authority. We answer to God. I'm not an anarchist. We set up governments to protect those rights and to protect ourselves from each other and from our own evil sides of our nature. But, right? But at the same time, the government itself is not to control. The rights come from us, and we grant the government a limited grant of power to protect and defend those natural rights so that we can be free to create and we can be free to live our lives.
Correct. And to administer and protect, right?
That's right, to protect. And that's why our founding fathers, in their ingenious development, recognized the value of the separation of powers, the diminution of power. And they derived a lot of that, by the way, from the Catholic Church, which I think developed a system of subsidiarity that worked very well. And it's the idea that if you separate powers, you put a silo of power like the judiciary here, you have the legislative there, you've got an executive who is the single person in this category, then they naturally will compete with each other and check each other. And yes, there's going to be corruption, but at least we have a running chance if they're at each other's throats so that we can then be free. You know, it's a sort of a natural balance. It's an ingenious idea, and it's worked well so far.
It's appalling to me, Charles. I don't remember seeing this ever in my lifetime. The number of people that are supporting in this recent conflict, and I don't know if there's a ceasefire still in place. I'm not sure, but the Palestinian side, and again, I don't want to get religious here, but that seems very, very appalling to me, because historically, of course, the United States has taken a very diplomatic approach to defending Israel. Do you have any comments on that, Charles?
Well, look, you're talking about a very complex conflict, and I would suggest that the Palestinian side has a legitimate argument, as does the Israeli side, in what's essentially a civil war. But I would argue on many, many different levels that the Israeli side is the better argument. It's not that the Palestinians don't have their points. They do. But in the bigger picture, and we could take a look at this on a lot of different levels, the Israeli side wins out every time. So I think that it is the better side. I also will tell you, I mean, I'm biased on this as a Jew. I believe that the Jewish people have a right to have a sovereign nation just like any other people, and that they've worked hard to achieve that. They have a historic claim to that land. They have a biblical claim to it. And that from a religious standpoint, the fact that they were able to achieve sovereignty in the state of Israel, which is that tiny little swath of land that God commanded Abraham to take possession of, that to me is a miracle, however it happened. They fought for it, they died for it, and they made it happen. And then in 1967, when they were able to take Jerusalem, that was another miracle. And now you have a state that exists almost exactly in the borders that the Old Testament says it should exist. Nothing more, nothing less. And to my way of thinking, that spiritually, for Muslims, Jews, and Christians, could be the beginning of the development, and I pray that it is, of a messianic age. And I would also just add briefly that there's a lot of controversy in Israel in terms of whether or not there should be the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem on the site of the Temple Mount, because the Al-Aqsa Mosque is actually built on top of what was Solomon's temple. And what I would say to that is that if that ever came about, it should be done as a joint effort between Jews and Muslims. The Jews can't do that alone. Solomon didn't do it alone. Solomon worked with the Muslims of his era, the Phoenicians, in partnership to build the temple. And that's would be the only way it could be done. And it would have to be done over a long period of time, probably 100 years. And it would have to involve a council set up equally of Jews and Muslims. So to my way of thinking, that would be the way forward for that. I base that on a reading of the Book of Kings, which is part of the Bible. And to my way of thinking, that's the best way forward.
We've got the United States, of course, has dealt with in one way or another an impression of communism within its governance, and that was no more apparent, of course, post World War II, I suppose. Is communism, does it remain a threat to our way of life, as you and I certainly identify with it under the U.S. Constitution, regardless of politics or political party? Does communism remain a threat to the American way of life, and has that surfaced in recent? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, it does. Now, that doesn't mean bringing back the old Soviet-style communism of Stalin or Lenin. But you have to, if you read the Communist Manifesto, and I've actually wrote a book about this. Marx does say in one of the planks of the manifesto that in order to advance the idea of communism, which is a world order of collectivist world where everything is equal, they'd have to adapt their methods to each society that they target, and they would have to adapt means by which they could weaken that society and soften it up so that it would accept the communist principles over time and very carefully. And the British actually followed that up by the development of the Fabian Society, which viewed they knew that Britain wasn't ready for socialism. So they would do it slowly by changing the meaning of words and changing the meaning of laws while leaving the trappings of freedom in place. I mean, Mussolini was a Bolshevik who recognized that Italy wasn't ready for communism because the Catholic Church was still too strong, and because it was a country of small shop owners and businessmen who would never accept communism. So he developed what he called the third way, which is fascism. It's halfway between communism and freedom. And eventually they would push and push until they reached the ultimate goal. And I think that same movement is very much in this country today. We can see it with the targeting of our society and the weakening of our society by claims that we are racist and that we have white supremacy. And, this is, the critical race theory is an example. And other areas where they are targeting our weaknesses and driving a wedge so that we can eventually fall into conflict, and then we'll be ripe for the taking. Lenin said that we'll fall like a piece of overripe fruit. And so we need to recognize that, and we need to recognize the nature of that. So old-fashioned communism run out of the Kremlin, that doesn't exist, but the idea is alive and well, and we need to understand it.
So you're mentioning Kremlin, but you're also mentioning Marx, and I'm thinking geographically in my mind, you've got Germany, and then you've got what we know as present-day Russia. Does communism come from Karl Marx, or in your research, does it come from somewhere else that predates Karl Marx?
Well, in the broad sense, it comes from Adam and Eve and the rebellion against God. I argue in my book, my latest book, The Satanic Conspiracy, that, and I don't know if we have much time to get into this into too much detail, but that Judaism was corrupted by this false messianic movement called Sabbateanism in the 16th century, and that Christianity was corrupted by a secretive and false messianic movement called Illuminism in the 17th century, and that these two movements have sort of set the groundwork for such figures as Marx and Darwin and Freud and some of these other actors who I think were front people for this philosophy, at least, if not literally. And that it's a movement that, while it continues to advance, we continue to advance in terms of our awareness, and we continue to combat it and confront it. But yeah, communism is not new. It goes back to ancient times. It just takes on different forms.
Right, and you're familiar with this in the 1960s, the Second Council on the Vatican, and this development of liberation theology. Do you find any tie-ins between this communism as we know it and this liberation theology? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think that the Roman Catholic Church has been one of the great bulwarks of freedom and one of the great arbiters of moral standards. And I look to it and I admire that. I think that the liberation theology was an attempt to infiltrate the church and try to corrupt it from within. There are a lot of theories about how successful that was or wasn't. I'm actually having on a priest next week who was close to several popes, who's going to, I think, talk about this on my show. I'm not an expert enough to know this. I hope and I pray that it's not the case, because it's one of the great moral forces in the world, that being the Catholic Church. And it has been fairly immune from these kinds of corruptions because of its hierarchical structure and because of its organization. You know, Judaism, certain Protestant faiths, they're a little bit more vulnerable to this because they don't have that kind of, you know, hierarchy and that kind of tradition and that kind of infrastructure. So, you know, yeah, I think that the liberation theology was an attempt to break that structure. I understand that when Pope John Paul II visited Cuba, Fidel Castro told him that Jesus was a communist, and yet at the same time, before the Pope left, he advised Castro and gave him some spiritual books that, you know, sought to turn him around, because after all, in his native Poland, it was the Roman Catholic Church that liberated Poland from communism, and it was the Roman Catholic Church that led to Irish independence too, I may add.
Yeah, it's a massive organization, and what I've been mentioning recently on my programs is that, like any large corporation, just like the United States, there is corruption. Get a little bit more into your book, and why did you choose Charles? Why did you choose the pyramid? I'm assuming that's the Egyptian pyramid. I don't know. Yeah. It looks like the same pyramid that's on the U.S. dollar. With this single eye, the overseeing eye, as some would refer to it. Why is that on the cover of your book, Charles?
Well, I mean, it represents the, you know, the symbol of Satanism. I don't know if the ancient Egyptians meant it to be that, but, you know, it to my way of thinking, it represents the Tower of Babel, which was an attempt by Nimrod to conquer God and to overthrow God in heaven, and that this is something that's happened in every generation. So we ought to be aware of that. Now, I don't know if you're implying that this has something to do with the Great Seal of the United States. That's an interesting subject. I don't know a lot about that. I am very critical of Masonry in my book for reasons that you'll have to, I mean, you know, you need to read the book to get to that. But at the same time, I recognize that, you know, not all secret societies are bad. I mean, the Masonic lodges, it can be quite good. After all, the Boston Tea Party was hatched by a Masonic type organization called the Sons of Liberty, and that George Washington was a Mason, and I think was one of the greatest men who ever lived. So, you know, it's not necessarily, the problem with it is that it is secret, so it can be infiltrated. In fact, I republished a letter in my book from Washington to this parishioner, this guy Snyder, who sent him a copy of Proofs of a Conspiracy by John Robeson, who was blowing the whistle on the fact that his Masonic lodge in Scotland had been infiltrated by the Illuminati. And Washington responded by saying, I'm very well aware of this tendency, and that he referred to it as diabolical. But he also said, I do not believe at this time that the Illuminati has infiltrated my lodge. And I tend to believe George Washington. I don't think it did at that time. Now, did it today? That's another question. And it did do it in Europe. I think that's historic. But generally, I hold all secret societies with some suspicion. I've never taken an oath to a secret society. You know, I mean, I've only taken 2 oaths in my life, as I like to say. The first one is to the United States when I pledge allegiance, and the second is to my wife. And, you know, right? And so, you know, when you take an oath to a secret society and you're putting the interests of that society over that of your own country, your own family. And by the way, I republished The Oath in Masonry, which is really blood-curdling and troubling. You've probably seen it. It's problematic. It's a conflict of interest. It's you know, what if you're a judge and you're sworn to a Masonic group, and you have before you a defendant who's also a member of your Masonic group? Can you rule against him? I mean, it creates, you know, problems in that. I think in this country we've always been suspicious of these kinds of secret societies and secret oaths. And I'll just end this comment by noting that, and I published this in one of my other books, that President John F. Kennedy warned us about secret societies in a speech he delivered to the American public. No, it was the American Publication Society early in his presidency, where he says, Yeah, I mean, and you can, and by the way, this isn't some conspiracy theory. It's on the JFK website of the JFK Library. You can just read it right there. It's incredible. He says, we should not trust secret societies. We should not trust oaths taken in secret, that it's not the American way. And, he goes on at length about this. So, that it's really the American way. Look, we all need secrecy, and secrecy has a role. You have the lawyer-client privilege. You've got the priest and the parishioner. You have to have some secrecy if you're going to function. Businesses have a right to have a non-disclosure agreement. They've got proprietary interests. You have to agree to that if you're going to work for a company. I've done that. You because they have an investment in something. But the problem is when it becomes entrenched at a high level and it becomes interactive with each other, it can become corrupting, and it is corrupting. It has become corrupting, and it has become dangerous.
Charles, granted, this is something that resonates with listeners. I wanted to get your quick thoughts on. Of course, we have. It can be a double-edged sword depending on how it's looked at. Again,
right.
And depending on how it's looked at, or perceived, or used, or practiced. There is a well-known in the circle of this topic. I'm not sure what rank he achieved in the U.S. Army, but he is from the 80s, I believe. Michael Aquino is a member of the Temple of Set.
Mm-hmm.
Francisco, he's a known Satanist, if you will. Has this notion, this conspiratorial, is the Satanic conspiratorial, and I want to wind down here with getting back to a little bit of your book, and I'll ask you another question after this. But has this satanic element, if you would, again, if that's speaking to listeners, has it to the highest offices in the land?
Yes, it's reached into the highest offices in all areas of power, whether it be in politics, in economy, in big business, in culture, and even in religion. Yes, it has, and it's interacting with likewise powerful elements in most countries in the world. And it's not loyal to any one country. It's not loyal to believe in a God. It's not loyal to the rights of all the institutions that make us free: private property, the right to trade goods and services, the right to, commerce, the right to control of our lives. So yes, I think it's a powerful, top-heavy development that has reached a point of critical mass in this world.
Wow, Charles, we can go on, and you're a plethora of knowledge and information, and I know this from having talked to you before. But let's wind down here and whet the appetite for listeners in regards to your book. And I'll ask you this question. I want you to describe a little bit more about what listeners can find in your book, where they can find it, where they can buy it. But the question I'm going to ask leading up into that is, what did you learn from what is the most important thing that you learned from writing this latest book of yours?
Well, the first thing I mean, this is, again, the second in a series. I mean, I've written 5 short books, but this is the second book about spiritual matters. And the first book I wrote, God is God, I approached it very much like I've approached all of my books, which is kind of, academically. I mean, I look at the history, I look at the culture. I have somewhat of a background in sociology, and I look at things like that. But when I wrote that book, I found that I was having a spiritual experience. I came to, in a way, know God. I mean, I felt that it transformed me in a way that I did not expect. And this book is a continuation of that, because part of that transformation has been to look at the darker side of existence, the absence of God, the Yetzer Hara, the falsehood. And that gets into a combination of belief and also history, in terms of chronicling the history of the satanic movement from Adam and Eve till today. So it gave me a chance to put together a brief outline of these things, much of which I've written in other formats in different ways. But, writing is a great way to crystallize your thinking on any subject. And I'm trying to write these books so that they're quick and easy reads. It's sort of like a manual. It's like a military manual. It gives you the pointers. It leads you in a direction of something where you may want to then go a bit of a deeper dive. I mean, this is not a big book. These are short books, but it gives you an outline to think about these things and then maybe do some deeper research. So, I'm enjoying writing them. And my newest one, I hope to have it done by the end of the summer, is going to be called The Blue Anon Conspiracy, which I think might speak for itself.
Wow, fascinating. And I think Eve was the first to partake of that forbidden fruit, right? So we can put the finger at the
no, I mean, I think that Adam was standing right next to her, though, and they did it together. That's why it was a conspiracy.
Very well said. Very well said, Charles. Charles, for listeners, where can they buy your book, and where can they find more information on you and what you're doing?
Thank you, Ian. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. You're one of the most erudite talk show hosts around, and you've been doing it a while, and you've got a great catalog, by the way, of interviews and of people you've talked to. And I know that you trace your ancestry to Alexander Hamilton, who was a great American patriot. The book is available The book's available at Amazon Books. Just put my name in the server, Charles Moskowitz, or the Satanic Conspiracy, and up it comes.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, Charles Moskowitz. Charles, until next time, keep up the great work, and thanks for coming on to the show.
Thank you, Ian. It's always a pleasure. Thanks a lot.